Hello once again, welcome to the Drydock episode 317 part 2. Let's just head straight on with questions because, well, they're not going anywhere and hopefully neither are you. Jack von Kuhn asks, Von der Tann was able to dispatch Indefatigable rather quickly during the run to the south. You've quoted her first gunnery officer's after-action report in a Drydock before. How was she able to zero in so quickly on Indefatigable? How many rounds did she actually expend to put her down? So it's a combination of several different factors. Firstly, the visibility conditions, both in terms of the light and the wind direction, and therefore where the gunnery smoke was blowing, favoured the Germans. So even if everything else was equal, you'd expect the German ships to start scoring their hits first. Secondly, you had the German fire control system, which specifically with the rangefinders, as I've covered before, the Germans used stereoscopic rangefinders, the British used coincidence rangefinders. There's a whole video explaining how those work, but the shorthand is essentially that stereoscopic rangefinders have a slightly higher skill ceiling, but a much higher skill floor. So, you need someone who's really good to operate them, and they can only operate them for a fixed amount of time. But if they are superb, you can get absolutely excellent results out of them. Coincidence rangefinders, you can still get very good results out of them, and they are somewhat easier to use. But the absolute best coincidence rangefinder operator will be at a slight disadvantage compared to the absolute best stereoscopic rangefinder officer for the 20 minutes or so that the stereoscopic rangefinder officer can last in prolonged use before he has to go away with a splitting headache. So there's a small advantage there. And then there's also the method of firing. So everybody uses different methods of firing, and by this point, listening to the channel, you probably know about full salvos, half salvos, etc., etc. The German method of firing, or at least the method being employed on Von der Tann specifically, consisted of firing half salvos, so 4 guns per quote-unquote salvo. And rather interestingly, as far as range was concerned, while they were trying to establish the range, most people would fire a half salvo all at the same range, let's say 20,000 yards, or in this case probably close to 15 or 16,000 yards, although the Germans are measuring in meters, obviously. And then you would look at the fall of shot and adjust based on that. And so you would maybe fire one half salvo, and then at the halfway point while that's in flight, you'd fire the next half salvo, and so on and so forth to get the maximum amount of data. Von der Tann did something slightly different. So she went, okay, I think this is the range. So let's say 15,000 yards. And then each of the 4 guns would be dialed to that range and then dialed back or forward to give an overall bracket measured in, well, let's switch over to meters because that's what the Germans were using, in 200 meter brackets. So if she's aiming at 15,000 meters, then one gun would be aimed at 14,900, another at 14,700, another at 15,100, and another at 15,300. So that actually gives you quite a wide bracket, almost a kilometre's worth of ranging data. So you fire that salvo, and then obviously if you see, let's say, 3 shells short and 1 over, that means you know that not only was your initial estimate of 15,000 meters wrong, but you now know that your range estimate is now between 15,100 and 15,300 meters. So then you can fire another salvo that's bracketed on, let's say, 15,200 meters, the split point. And now if you get 2 short and 2 over, then you're absolutely sure, right, we're definitely at 15,200. So then you can fire your next salvo at 15,200 and hopefully you'd start getting hits. Now, in order to do that, from the moment she starts firing until the last salvo that she fires that scores a hit on Indefatigable, and then it's very clear that Indefatigable is dead. I mean, it's fairly clear from the explosion that she's dead 1 salvo earlier, but she ends up firing a total of 13 half salvos, so 13 salvos, 4 guns per salvo, expends 52 shells. And that happens over the course of just under a quarter of an hour, And at one point, they do end up going to rapid fire. So although on average, they're shooting a half salvo every minute or so, in actual fact, it's more like the early ranging salvos are probably being fired at 1.5 to 2 minute increments, because they're firing, then they've got to observe the fall of shot, work out where those shots are, and make some fine adjustments both for range and for traverse, and then check the next one and so on and so forth, and adjust the guns accordingly. Whereas once they've got the range, then they do shift to rapid fire. Runon asks, if modern combustible case ammunition, like what we see on some attack aircraft, was made available and practical for naval caliber guns just after the First World War, what would the likely impacts be on autoloader technology as it was being developed? Well, it would make the whole process a little bit easier and the overall mechanism just that little bit lighter, because of course with auto-loading guns, the 6-inch and the 8-inch, as you can see on USS Salem here, part of the system had to involve, okay, the guns are fired, now we need to open the breech block, obviously, to get more ammunition in, but also you have to get the cartridge out. And once the cartridge is out, unless you want a build-up of dangerously hot brass in your turret, which, spoiler alert, you don't, you have to have an ejection mechanism so you can get the cartridge case out in a secure and reliable manner and ideally dump it outside of the turret. If your case has been combusted, then you don't need to worry about all of that. All of that mechanism can go away, which also in theory means you can load the ammunition slightly faster and therefore increase your overall rate of fire, although I would put a caveat on that of you don't want to increase your rate of fire too much, because otherwise you might end up with a dangerous heat build-up in the gun itself. You know, given that HMAS Sydney managed to dangerously overheat its guns using manual loading, really, really rapid fire autoloader would run exactly the same kind of risks. Now, when I've been looking through what combustible case ammunition is used for, it does seem it's used for some fairly hefty artillery in the modern world. So 6-inch guns definitely can, and I suspect you could probably get an 8-inch combustible case shell if you really wanted to. However, a few of them do note that they use a metallic disc at the base to allow sliding breech block mechanisms to be used, which is the mechanism you use for rapid-fire autoloaders. So it wouldn't be entirely combustible case, but I suppose it would be a case of, well, breech block comes down, you just have to kick off the metal disc at the bottom, which is a lot easier to get rid of than a full case. And at that point, you might actually just have a little collector bin underneath the gun to collect all the discs, because that small amount of metal will be easy to collect and dispose of later on rather than the full case. Sapper Ninja asks, the YouTuber Perun is someone whose content I greatly appreciate, and in his original viral video, All Bling No Basics, he asked a theoretical question that perhaps some military analysts don't. What if the enemy just says no? What are some great naval examples of someone just saying no to the best laid plans of their opposition, such as fighting on when their opposition thinks they should have surrendered by now, or perhaps the amazingly complex Japanese Navy plans where the US Navy just did something else? To a certain extent, you could perhaps even look at the High Seas Fleet generally as an example of this, because of course the British wanted the High Seas Fleet to come out to sea and have a big stand-up fight which would decide which navy was the best, and then presumably they hoped the Royal Navy would win, and then they could get on with the business of strangling Germany out of the war. And for a variety of reasons, the weird thing is most of the German High Seas Fleet's officers were, with certain preconditions, quite happy to sail out and meet the British fleet. But higher up command structures like the Kaiser and some of their early admirals really didn't seem to want to, at least without hilariously unrealistic conditions. So in a way, the early war, 1914-1915 High Seas Fleet, pretty much was a no to the British plan. Although, to be fair, I think the British plan had slightly forgotten that, yes, you did have a number of big showdown battles with the French in the Napoleonic Wars, But what about the years upon years upon years upon years of blockading that led up to that? And then you only really got the battle when the French and later the Franco-Spanish fleet sailed to try and achieve one of their objectives, and you managed to catch them out. That bit seems to have slipped the minds of a good many officers in the Royal Navy in World War One. One that almost worked, but was caught out the last minute, was HMS Repulse dodging and weaving against the Japanese torpedo bombers, because, of the two in foresaid, Repulse and Prince of Wales, theoretically, Prince of Wales, with the modern torpedo defence system, etc., should have been the much tougher nut to crack, but in part thanks to that lucky hit on the propeller shaft, Prince of Wales was out of action long before Repulse, and Repulse was just sitting there dancing around like a destroyer rather than a massive battle cruiser going, yes, I fully understand and comprehend the theoretical framework by which your masses of twin-engine torpedo bombers, which are considerably faster than my ship, can manoeuvre and drop torpedoes at an ideal range, and my relatively inadequate anti-aircraft battery isn't really going to do all that much to you, and therefore you should be able to hit me relatively easily. However, I reject your reality and substitute my own, and watch this, torpedo beats, torpedo beats, torpedo beats, and making the Japanese pilots expend a good chunk of all aerial dropped torpedoes that the Japanese had in theatre at the time, and then by more luck than judgment, it seems, they managed to pull off a pincer attack on Repulse, which she couldn't dodge because there was nowhere to dodge. But, if they hadn't had that lucky break, you could have had this really weird situation of, a handful of torpedoes and the modern King George V was on the bottom, and then the Japanese expend every single other torpedo they have, and Repulse might have well been sitting there going, that was fun, let's do it again sometime. Or another example would be some of the British ships like the Mars at the Battle of Trafalgar, because traditionally speaking, when a ship of the line is dismasted and under fire from multiple other ships, that is when you surrender. Whereas 2 or 3 British ships at the Battle of Trafalgar found themselves in a condition where they had been completely dismasted and were under fire from multiple ships of the Franco-Spanish fleet, and their response to this was to wait for a slight lull in the fighting, jury-rig a single sail and half-mast out of some debris they found lying around on the top deck, and merrily wander their way, mostly out of control, but at least heading in vaguely the right direction, into the fight, under the premise of we can still shoot at things and no one's tried to board us yet. And another example, I think, actually, in a roundabout way, could be the US fleet submarines, the Gatos and Palaos and Tenches. As I said to a few people at USS Cod earlier this month, in some ways you could look at the American fleet subs and call them the greatest successful failures, because if you look at their original role as the fleet submarine, sticking to that objective, they were complete and utter failures of colossal proportions. It just so happens that what they were reaching for in trying to make a fleet submarine, i.e. a submarine that could operate ahead of and as part of the battle fleet, much in the same way that the K-class had been trying to do 2 decades earlier, happened to also give you a submarine that was near enough perfect for deep water Pacific Ocean commerce raiding. So, if you imagine the Japanese having done all their intelligence, all their research on the development of US fleet submarines, they're like, aha, well, clearly the Americans will not be able to use their submarines because they've developed them very, very specifically for this one particular role, much like our own glorious Japanese Navy submarines. And, well, their submarines don't work in that role, so clearly their submarines will be useless in this war. Yeah, okay, fix the Mark 14 in the background, but once that's been done, look outside. Why is the Japanese merchant fleet on fire and sinking in sight of Tokyo Harbour? You're not supposed to be working! Meanwhile, the US submarine captains are going, no, I have decided we shall instead work in a completely different way that you didn't see coming. I mean, yes, that's the whole objective of submarines, but also metaphorically. HMS Etc. asks, could you please briefly review the 4 major Pacific carrier battles of 1942? At least for me, Sea and Midway are a bit more ingrained into the collective unconscious. However, the second 2 battles, Cruz and Eastern Solomons, are a bit less familiar. Okay, well, this is going to be very abbreviated. So, each battle, from a very broad perspective, can be regarded under 2 metrics, the tactical and strategic levels. The tactical is essentially who managed to sink the most ships, the most important ships, from the other side. The strategic level is, did you actually complete the overall mission objectives? And it is possible to succeed at one and not the other, as we will see. So the Battle of Coral Sea was a tactical Japanese victory. They damaged Yorktown and sank Lexington, amongst various other ships, but in terms of the big headliner stuff, assuming that you don't headline poor old Neosho. But anyway, the Japanese managed to destroy an enemy fleet carrier and badly damage another. In exchange, they took damage to a fleet carrier and lost a light carrier. Therefore, tactically, they won. Strategically, however, they lost, because the objective of the Japanese fleet at that time was to safely escort an invasion force to take Port Moresby. As a result of the carrier battle, despite the fact that the Americans lost more carriers and, more tonnage of carriers and had to leave the field, the Japanese didn't feel that they could complete their objective, and they had to withdraw, and thus the invasion didn't happen. So, obviously, the American objective being to stop the invasion, they succeeded in that. So, strategic American victory. Midway, strategic and tactical American victory, because, of course, the American objective to stop the Midway landings and also to preserve at least most of their carriers, ideally all, but most is also good. Japanese objective, land and capture Midway. Did they capture Midway? No. Did the Americans preserve their carriers? Well, apart from Yorktown, yes. And technically speaking, they lost Yorktown, the Japanese lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. So, very definitely solid American win. Battle of the Eastern Solomons, tactical and strategic American win. The objective for both sides involved Japanese reinforcement convoys heading for Guadalcanal. The Japanese obviously wanted them to get there. The Americans wanted to stop them. And in the engagement, the Japanese lost a light carrier and a bunch of other ships, as well as a lot of aircraft. The Americans had one carrier damaged, fleet carrier, and they managed to stop the convoy. So the Japanese were forced to resort to other methods of resupplying Guadalcanal. So they completed their strategic objective, and they did it with significantly less in terms of lost aircraft and lost ships. In fact, they didn't lose any ships directly to the Japanese attacks, although one fleet carrier being heavily damaged wasn't ideal. And then Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, a tactical heavy Japanese victory, but strategically quite a significant defeat. So in that battle, obviously the Americans lost the carrier Hornet, Enterprise was damaged, a number of other ships were damaged, including a destroyer being sunk, in exchange for which the Japanese had one fleet carrier damaged and a smaller carrier also damaged, as well as a couple of other ships. The Japanese and American aircraft losses were actually about equal. The Japanese lost slightly more aircraft, but lost massively more pilots and aircrew. So, materially speaking, the pilots and aircrew was a slight tactical loss, but overall, in terms of, ships sunk, who was available in the next few days to fight, etc., it was a very significant tactical Japanese win. However, strategically, what was the objective? Well, the Japanese were trying to support the Japanese Army's attack on Henderson Field, and more broadly to either capture or knock out Henderson Field so that they could operate in the area in daylight without Henderson Field's aircraft constantly attacking and sinking various Japanese ships. And they didn't succeed in that. The amount of damage that the Japanese fleet took, although materially speaking overall less than the American fleet, did force them to eventually withdraw, as they were unable to continue support operations, and therefore the Japanese attack, the initial phase of which had already been repulsed, really didn't have any further chance of succeeding, and therefore the Allies held on to Henderson Field. The Americans were continued able to operate aircraft from it and continued to attack Japanese shipping, so strategically a loss for Japan. Nick Brodar asks, could the Italians have successfully invaded Malta during World War II? I think there's two potential answers here. Could the Italians have successfully brute force invaded Malta, as in just stuff a bunch of troops into ships and aircraft, sail and fly over there, and just put them ashore, fight their way into Valletta, and say, hey, look, we're in charge now? Theoretically, it's possible. But there's a difference between being able to successfully land and actually being able to successfully invade and capture the place. Because, as many people have said before, including myself, Malta is a parachutist's worst nightmare, especially if you're a World War II parachutist. So, yeah, you'd probably try and use paratroops. You'd probably lose most of them to the terrain. And what's left is going to be hobbling around with broken ankles and legs if they're lucky. So, yeah, that side of things probably going to be a bit of a damn squib. But could the Italians have formed up their entire fleet after they've patched up most of the losses from Taranto and gone, hey, look, we're just sending everything with a bunch of troop transports and we're going to land as close to Valletta as possible? Yeah, they could do that. They've got the force to be able to do that. But I don't think it would succeed long term, because yes, they'd probably get troops ashore, but they would be under constant attack from the destroyers and submarines and aircraft based in Malta, and they'd very shortly thereafter, if they've committed everything, be under attack from aircraft and submarines and destroyers from Force H and from the Mediterranean fleet. And of course, with the need to protect the troop transports, the Italian ships are going to be pinned down. So one of their greatest advantages, their average much higher speed than the British, is going to be negated. And once they've taken appropriate levels of losses, then the Mediterranean fleet and Force H would move in to finish off the survivors, at which point it would be the single greatest catastrophe in Italian naval history, and the invasion would fail, because even if they'd made headway up on the ground, they now have no means of resupplying themselves. The flip side to that, of course, is that could the Italians have taken Malta in some way, shape or form during World War II? And the answer to that is yes, because you look at just how razor thin some of the margins were for Malta during the resupply convoy operations, and you realise that had one or two of those resupply operations gone just a little bit worse, let's say the tanker Ohio exploding and catching fire like it probably should have done, rather than making it to Malta mostly held up by the buoyancy of its own cargo, then Malta would run out of supplies. If they run out of supplies, they go into starvation mode. If they have no food, no fuel, no ammunition, then the ships and aircraft based at Malta can't fly and sail to defend it. The people who can't eat and therefore are starving, obviously there is a limit to how much you can expect them to endure, at which point, if the Malta convoys had been hit that little bit harder, it is possible that Malta might have been forced to surrender, at which point, of course, the Italians could invade and take it over. Whether they could hold it or not is another matter entirely, because, of course, now they have the job of resupplying Malta, and it's the Allied submarines and aircraft who are trying to disrupt the supplies. So, yeah, fun times. Al Sadius asks, when Winston Churchill wrote his book about World War I, a scenario he seems to have worried about a lot is the High Seas Fleet attacking the British troop convoys in the opening days of the war, and it seems that Tirpitz also thought post-war that this would have been their least bad chance. How would it have likely gone for the German fleet if they'd tried this? So the Germans would have faced a few problems. Now, in a way, they do have an advantage, because if they hightail it out of Wilhelmshaven and head roughly west and then southwest, they do have a physically shorter route to get to the Dover Straits and then into the English Channel as compared to the Grand Fleet up in Scapa. And if they do this early enough in World War I, before the British have captured all those lovely code books or been gifted them from the German ship that went aground and so forth, then the British won't be able to read their codes, so they're not going to have quite the same signals intel advantage that they did for the majority of World War I. Now, if we give the Germans a few, little boosts, so let's say they get out of harbour relatively undetected. The British are aware that they've sailed. They'll be able to tell that just from the rate of radio traffic and how it moves and dies down. But they won't have advanced warning or know exactly where they're going. So the Grand Fleet is on its way roughly south. The Germans head west. They'll be spotted at some point before they enter the Dover Straits, and they'll have to contend with whatever minefields have been put up at that point. It won't be quite as intense as later on, but they'll be there. So let's assume, again, just for the sake of circumstance, that by luck or judgment they managed to avoid the worst of the British minefield, so No major losses. Maybe a couple of destroyers or a cruiser hits a mine or something, but that's about it. They've now got to contend with the Harwich force. Can the Harwich force stop them? No. There aren't anywhere near enough small cruisers and destroyers to do so. Obviously, the High Seas Fleet has its own cruisers and destroyers, as well as the battleships and so forth. Can the Harwich force delay them and potentially cause some casualties with mass torpedo attacks? Yes, especially depending on when this attack is taking place, because ideally the Germans will want to have as much of the day as possible, because they'll need to scour the channel up and down, left and right, and maybe even chase some troop transports and merchant ships into various ports. So this pass through the Dover Straits is probably going to happen at night, which does increase the lethal effect of small craft like destroyers. So they will take some losses, potentially some relatively big ones as well going through, as in, they might lose a few capital ships, not as in they'll lose tons of them. But with those, little caveats in place, there's a reasonable chance they can actually get into the channel before much can be done to stop them. There are some obsolete pre-dreadnoughts also that can be thrown into the mix by the British, either in the Channel or in the Thames estuary. I don't fancy their chances. They'd mostly be brushed aside in a little bit more of a spectacular manner as the Harwich force, but there you go. So yes, a somewhat diminished High Seas Fleet probably make it into the Channel and start laying waste to various British and French ships, which obviously, as word gets out, they'll all skedaddle. Various coastal defences who may or may not be able to bring guns to bear will open up, and so on and so forth. But the biggest problem the Germans are going to have is that at whatever point they decide they've had enough and they turn back to head through the Dover Straits to get home, that's when they're going to find the Grand Fleet waiting for them, at which point, well, the Germans will have been running most of the day at high speed with dodgy coal. They will have sustained some losses and some further damage, and whatever's left of the Harwich force will be very, very happy to have teamed up with the entire torpedo, boat and destroyer flotillas of the Grand Fleet and be waiting for them along with all the battleships of the Grand Fleet. And there's not really a lot the Germans can do about it, because they pretty much have to sail back through that very confined narrow stretch of water in order to get home. And before anyone asks, yes, submarines might be a small factor, but broadly speaking, the German subs are going to have to be told to stay out of the area, because you're, in theory, had the plan gone perfectly, going to have German capital ships streaming one way and then streaming back the other way on a slightly uncertain timetable. So having U-boats there in the vicinity as well, and trusting them to try and recognise, is that a German pre-dreadnought or a British pre-dreadnought or cruiser or destroyer? That's pretty much suicidal. You would keep them away. So, and we're talking about the very limited number and limited performance of 1914 U-boats as well. So they're probably going to be a relative non-issue. So then you'll have your big sea fight, except it's a sea fight where the Germans can't dodge. They're in confined waters. They have to try and force their way through the Grand Fleet, and that's pretty much the best case scenario for the Grand Fleet, fighting right off their coast, potentially under the cover of shore guns, with a numbers advantage and a desperate opponent that's already been damaged and potentially has worked their engines to the bone with poor quality coal. The High Seas Fleet would be pretty much annihilated. Yeah, the British might take some losses of their own, of course, but at the end of the day, the British have a lot more ships to lose. Both sides have some dodgy ammunition handling policies at this point, so that's not an inherent German advantage the way it would be at Jutland. It'd be more like it was at Dogger Bank. And of course, the British have a lot more ships and a lot more modern ships coming down the pipeline. So even if it's equal losses, and the Germans lose most of the High Seas Fleet and the British lose a good chunk of the Grand Fleet, in a year or two's time, the Germans are going to have made completion of a handful of ships, and the British will have completed well over a dozen brand new modern battleships and battle cruisers. So net British victory. And I think that's pretty much why the Germans didn't do it, because it's all very well temporarily disrupting some troop convoys, but if you lose the main body of your battle fleet in doing so right at the start of the war, that's not a good trade. Paul from Chicago asks, if a gerbil with the speed force and a rather robust running wheel was placed into the engine room of Queen Elizabeth, giving her let's say 15,000 more horsepower, could she actually have gotten up to her designed top speed? Or put differently, during the refits, the Queen Elizabeths were not made faster, at least not substantially. Would small tube boilers have actually gotten them to 26 or 27 knots? And could they have been made viable, true fast battleships in World War II? Or is the hull form just not quite the thing? I think you definitely could have gotten them up to speed using that much more horsepower. One of the things you've got to remember is that when they were refitted, they actually, well, that's Queen Elizabeth, Valiant and Warspite, that is, they actually got slightly more power out of their new boilers on a substantially reduced floor space for boilers. I mean, obviously fewer boilers as well, but the actual floor space was significantly reduced because they wanted to use that floor space for other things like anti-aircraft magazines. In fact, if you get the Battleship Warspite plans book by Robert Brown, it actually has both plans of Warspite before and after her refit and an overlay plan that shows you where the boiler rooms were reduced. So with a smaller boiler room space, with the modern boilers, they actually got a little bit more power, which meant they got just a fraction more speed, a little closer to their original 25 knot speed, even with all the additional weight. Now, winding back to the question, although obviously, as you mentioned, hull form definitely is a thing. You can see that with the Italians. You know, the Italians, when they refit the Conte di Cavour, for instance, they give Conte di Cavour approximately similar power output to a Queen Elizabeth, but they managed to get the poor old Conte di Cavour up to a speed that's closer to 27 knots, which is considerably more than the QE, and that's largely thanks to, one, having a new bow, improving their length to beam ratio, and two, Conte di Cavour just displaces less, so it's a lighter ship with, especially with that new bow, a better hull form and the same amount of power, therefore, so unsurprisingly, gets them to go somewhat faster. Now, with the QEs, ideally, yes, maybe sticking a little bit of an extra bow to improve their length to beam ratio might buy you a little bit more speed as well, but using a quick but crude analysis, and that's why it's quick, you can compare the horsepower per ton output of various contemporary ships, and then you look at their top speed, and then you suddenly realize roughly why they end up in this kind of scenario. So your typical ships that are doing 21 knots in the battle line, Iron Duke and German contemporaries, etc., they tend to have a horsepower per ton ratio of about 1.2 on average. The Revenge class, which are a bit faster, 1.35. But then you look at Invincible and Indefatigable. Now, they are lighter ships and somewhat slimmer, the battle cruisers, but they make 25 to 26 knots, and their horsepower per ton is approximately 2.35 to 2.4 horsepower per ton. And interestingly enough, Conte di Cavour, which in its original format is about as fast as a Revenge class, although a little bit lighter, uses its power plant and has a 1.35 horsepower per ton ratio, almost exactly the same ratio as a Revenge class to do almost exactly the same speed. So that's an interesting side point there, because obviously the Conte di Cavour's original form has a weaker power plant than Revenge class, but is also a lighter vessel. So with all that in mind, you look at, well, what is the Queen Elizabeth's class power output and speed and tonnage? Well, it works out at about 2.3 horsepower per ton. And suddenly, it suddenly becomes very evident why they didn't end up hitting their top speed. They were just a fraction underpowered and probably with quick additions, maybe slightly overweight. Incidentally, another ship that's doing 22 to 23 knots that also makes almost exactly 1.35, in this case 1.36 horsepower per ton, is the Fuso class. Now, if you slap another 15,000 shaft horsepower on the QEs, that gives you 90,000 shaft horsepower, and that gives you a horsepower per ton of 2.76. Now, for reference, the Lion class, which could make a bit over 27 knots, have a horsepower per ton ratio of 2.66. The Der Flingers, which design speed 26.5 knots, 2.33, And Nagato, which is a battleship and can make 26.5 knots in her original configuration, is 2.43. So that would suggest, again, using a crude calculation, not accounting for hull form and hull length, that, yeah, sticking 15,000 horsepower additional on QE, and you're going to actually exceed 25 knots by quite a margin. In fact, you may be outpacing quite a number of battle cruisers at that point. In fact, if you dial it down, you actually get a similar horsepower per ton ratio for Queen Elizabeth and Nagato, because of the similar displacements, at 80,000 shaft horsepower, which would suggest that you'd be pushing 26 to 26.5 knots in a QE, maybe closer to 26 with the hull form differences, just with an extra 5,000 shaft horsepower. So, now you can see why Jellicoe was thinking small tube boilers across the whole thing. If I can buy myself 5 to 10,000 more shaft horsepower, I'm going places. HMS Implosive asks, with hindsight, what was the last battleship that was worth the cost to build for its navy? For example, did the US Navy really need any of its fast battleships, or would they have done better just churning out even more cruisers and a few more of the Essex swarm? Now, this is a bit of a difficult one because, well, for one thing, there's a lot of different opinions on how useful battleships were, period, in World War II, and I'm sure that'll start a little bit of a war in the comments. But even then, there's also the case of where are your battleships being applied? Because you could argue, for example, that for the Royal Navy, there wasn't any point in building the King George V's, except for the fact that the Vittorio Venetos, or the Littorios more properly, and the Bismarcks existed, and to a lesser extent Scharnhorst. But the thing is, Scharnhorst ran away from Rodney. Well, more accurately, Kaiser ran away from Rodney, but that just makes no difference. And even poor old Malaya was able to scare both of the Scharnhorsts off of a convoy, and Renown sent both Scharnhorsts running in the action off Lofoten. So you don't need a King George V to match the Scharnhorsts. What you do need a King George V to do is match the Bismarcks, because Rodney can kill Bismarck, she can't catch it. Okay, granted, Bismarck is slightly faster than King George V, but King George V can close that gap quite considerably, and therefore would be able to do so. So if you remove the case of the Italians building the Littorios and the Germans building the Bismarcks, and you just have the Italians refitting the Duilios and Conte de Cavours, and the Germans, for whatever reason, terminate their battleship construction with the Scharnhorst, or just build one or two more, then you could say that at that point, had the UK gone ahead with building the King George V, it wasn't worth the cost. As long as Germany and Italy had modern fast battleships, Britain needed the King George V's. And now, the reason I've left Japan out of that equation is because, obviously, the 1930s fast battleship that the Japanese built was Yamato, and one-on-one King George V is not the thing you need to go and fight Yamato. So, there's that. Now, you flip that around to the Germans. Well, you could say the last battleship that was worth the cost to the Germans was probably something like the Braunschweigs, because, their dreadnoughts managed to get them involved in a war with Britain on the opposite side, to a certain extent, and the whole naval arms race in World War I, and in World War II, the Scharnhorst and the Bismarcks, you managed to tie down the British forces for a little while, right up until they invented the tall boy or mass mobbing. So, not really worth it for them. Obviously, we know that with hindsight. They didn't necessarily always know that at the time. The Italians, I would argue, actually, pretty much all their battleships, bar maybe Roma, were worth it. And the only reason Roma probably wasn't worth it was because she was completed relatively late in the day and mainly existed to serve as a Fritz X target. But that's within the context of the actual conflict. But as far as the Italians are concerned, they have air cover, for the most part, from Italy itself, and, having a couple of modern fast battleships allows them a freedom of action which they otherwise would not have because, well, again, Warspite versus Giulio Cesare. The British can handle the older Italian ships, even refitted. Vittorio Veneto forces the British to play the game a lot more cagily and eventually commit a lot more resources to the area. So there's that. For the Japanese, well, the Congos, well, they're battle cruisers, but they're the last capital ships prior to the Nagatos. The Nagatos, probably worth it, even if only because it bought Japan the number 3 spot at the Washington Naval Conference, despite the fact there was absolutely no way, any chance of Japan's economy keeping up that for any particular length of time. But the Yamatos, well, they managed to confuse the Allies and absorb quite a lot of bombs and torpedoes, but that was about it. So yeah, Yamatos overall probably not worth it. For the Americans, and I think they're actually the hardest ones to judge for, because the Washington, North Carolina, and to a certain extent the early South Dakotas were incredibly useful anti-aircraft escorts. The sheer anti-aircraft firepower they could muster to defend the aircraft carriers was definitely worth it. They could put out a huge amount more than cruisers could. They could also withstand the occasional bomb or hit from Japanese aircraft in a way that cruisers couldn't. And then you have a similar situation to the British with the King George V. If the Japanese hadn't built the Yamatos, you could make a certain argument that the North Carolinas and South Dakotas were probably about all you needed. Because, okay, yeah, the Japanese, the Congos, are considerably faster than the old standards. The Nagatos, also a reasonable amount. Fusos and Isseis, they're a little bit slower and fairly out of date, so you can handle them with the standards, but a theoretical Nagato and Congo lineup could just outrun a standard battle line. So building the North Carolinas and South Dakotas to kind of 1v1 them, but obviously with superior quality and firepower, that makes sense. The Iowas, yes, there is an argument to use them to more easily hunt down the Congos, and yes, they can keep up with the fast carriers in a way that the other ships can't, but you could have done that with the Alaskas instead, if it wasn't also for the fact that whatever the Yamatos were going to be, they were going to be built, and so you also needed them for that. So if the Japanese hadn't built the Yamatos, the Iowas were probably unnecessary. With the Japanese building the Yamatos, the Iowas definitely become necessary. And yes, I know, things like the Yamato and Musashi were eventually killed by carrier aircraft, but I return you to the point I've raised previously, which is that those kills were achieved with many times those battleships' displacement in carriers launching aircraft at them, which, yes, you can do it. It is not, however, a particularly efficient way of doing it, and you only need a patch of bad weather or the Japanese sailing at a slightly different time, like, say, nighttime, and suddenly your carriers are not operational, but the battleship very much is. Andre de Coult asks, you've mentioned repeatedly on the channel that the 11-inch guns of the Scharnhorst were considerably more modern and powerful than the 11-inch guns of the Deutschlands. Besides having a slightly longer barrel, and doesn't seem a huge amount, what other improvements made the Scharnhorst guns so much better? Mainly the shells. Now, the Scharnhorst guns could take a somewhat larger charge, but that didn't actually result in a higher muzzle velocity because the shells were somewhat heavier. Now, it might not sound too much when you look at the initial shell weights, and the Deutschland 11-inch is 300 kilos, because it's in German, so we're using metric, versus 330 kilos for the Scharnhorst. But remember, that's a 10% increase in overall mass. Suddenly that sounds like a lot more. This is for the AP shell, obviously. And that's why you need more explosive to propel that thing through the air. The other thing is that that mass doesn't just come from, putting a bit more steel in it. It comes from the fact that the shape of the shell head, and therefore also the AP cap that sits on it, is somewhat different. It's a bit more elongated on the Scharnhorst's shells, and that gives it significantly better armor penetration capability just from the design of the shell, let alone the fact it's also heavier and therefore carrying a little bit more kinetic energy when it hits for a given impact speed and angle. And also, it also helps with oblique angle impacts, because a relatively blunt-headed shell like you find on the Deutschlands is going to most likely either disintegrate or skip at higher angles of impact, which are usually associated with longer ranges. The Scharnhorst ones are less likely to do so. And the net result of that can be seen if you look at the range data for the two. So let's take a decent battle range, 20,000 meters. For the German guns on the Deutschlands, they're going to impact at just over 1,300 feet per second, with an angle of fall of a little over 21 degrees, whereas the Scharnhorst are going to impact with almost 1,600 feet per second, so they've retained a lot more speed going out to that distance, and they're hitting at an angle of fall of only 17.2 degrees. So they're hitting harder because they're hitting a bit faster and with more mass, so that's obviously going to add up to a fair bit more energy being translated into impact, with much better shaped and formed armor-piercing caps and shell heads. And they're coming in at a slightly shallower angle, hitting the belt armor, which means that they're going to have a better time of it anyway, regardless of all those other factors, and hence, overall, obviously adds up to considerably better armor penetration. Richard Shu asks, after the Soviet Union was established, did Japan's naval developments impact Soviet naval shipbuilding or warship design, especially when it came to the Soviet Pacific Fleet? And if so, how? To a certain extent, but not massively. If you look at where the Russians were deploying their ships in the 1930s, and to be honest, the 1940s as well, the Russians were far, far, far more concerned about potential European issues. And you can see that in their deployment. They don't ever send a capital ship to the Pacific Fleet. They barely have a presence, to be perfectly honest. They have a couple of cruisers, handful of destroyers. A lot of small, fast attack craft, though. And this is the thing you've got to remember. The Japanese building a fleet for a Pacific conflict have to think about fighting the Americans on the other side of the Pacific, and the Americans are vice versa. And even the British, when they're thinking about the Pacific, they're having to come in from the Indian Ocean and get all the way across the Southwest Pacific. The Russians, if they're thinking at all about a Pacific conflict, once they've got over the institutional trauma that was the Battle of Tsushima, is a relatively close-range affair. They've got to go to Japan, but Japan isn't exactly far. So they don't need to make any special considerations for long-distance cruising in high temperatures. They just have to essentially go to the equivalent of the bottom of the road and turn left. And, hey, they're there. But they're not really thinking, as I said, about conflict with Japan much at all. As time goes on and you get into the 1940s, then you start to see the Pacific Fleet being built up a little bit more, at least on paper. They do send a few more destroyers and so forth there as well in practice. But, for example, when they're looking at the Sovietsky Soyuzes, you do see a plan to put a bunch of them in the Pacific Fleet, but that is actually more about the fact that the American fleet is getting very large and they might need to guard Russia's eastern borders against the US Navy than it is about fighting the Japanese. Because they're pretty sure the Americans are going to get rid of the Japanese long before the Sovietsky Soyuzes are completed in any kind of large numbers, which turns out to be a very accurate prediction. So they're not really building anything specifically for the Pacific. They are obviously taking into account some of the slightly higher temperatures you might run into as vague considerations, but, well, the Black Sea gets pretty warm as well, so it's certainly in the summer months. So, yeah, the Russians are not having any major design influences on what they're doing as a result of Japan. Riva's Rambling Recess asks, regarding the formation of the Italian Navy from the various naval traditions across Italy, were fleets and minor navies just gobbled up from the various Italian states, and how did this influence their founding naval traditions? And as an aside, if you do know, to what extent was the papal influence involved, not involved, or had hilarity ensue? Papal influence pretty much wasn't involved, mostly because the Pope had other things to worry about, like the fact the newly declared Kingdom of Italy would really, really like to take Rome as his capital and take away most of the Papal States from him, and the only thing propping him up was a French garrison. Not that they could have stopped the Italians, but it would have meant war with France, which they didn't want to risk until after the Franco-Prussian War, when the French garrison was recalled, and then suddenly the newlified Italian state decided, right, well, we're having Rome now, thank you very much. But the actual formation of the Italian Navy was literally, yeah, don't care if you're Piedmont, Venice, Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, everybody's ships, you're now Italian. And yeah, that had some problems because different states had obviously formatted their fleets and naval doctrines around slightly different layouts and strategies, and rivalries between admirals who had formerly been of opposing navies. Yeah, that took a while to get over. That was kind of the problem at the Battle of Lissa. Nobody really liked Persano. Persano was difficult enough to get on with as it was, let alone the fact that most of his subordinates had, up until very recently, been his potential opponents, and now they're all expected to fight together. Yeah, it took a while to smooth things out, let's just say. If the gods had wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh Look Mead asks, in your recent collaborations with Epic History about the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, it was mentioned that the Spanish fleet used the Levant wind to pass the Strait of Gibraltar, which then took them out into the Atlantic Ocean, which they didn't quite bargain for. Was that a skill issue on the part of the Spanish, a calculated risk, or just bad luck? So with apologies for the shaky cam, because this was after I'd climbed the entire Rock of Gibraltar on foot, because I'm an idiot and didn't realise where the cable car was. This is actually the Levantar wind in action. So the Mediterranean is off to your left, the Bay of Gibraltar off to your right, and you can see, well, you could see before I turned away, that billowing cloud, which doesn't actually exist on the west side of the rock, and instead is forming as it comes up and over. And here's a picture I took from the runway of Gibraltar Airport, and again you can see it. Now, this was when I landed, obviously the other videos from a couple of days later. So in this video there is high cloud cover, which you can see just off to the left, but you can again see the effect of the Levantar streaming off the rock. So what happens is, it's called a Levantar because the wind originates in the Levant in the Middle East and comes racing all the way across the Mediterranean, picking up a ton of moisture, and then it funnels itself through the Gibraltar Straits, and then when it hits the rock, the hot moisture-laden air goes up the rock, very dramatically increasing in altitude very, very quickly, and then when it crests over, it now finds itself in the shadow, or the wind shadow of the rock, so it's at higher altitude and in a cooler environment, so it immediately condenses and you get this streaming cloud forming off of the rocks. As I said, if you're coming at it from the Mediterranean, you would see the eastern face of the rock and it would look nice and clear, but you come around the other side and there's this pool of cloud hanging over it and heading off into the Atlantic. Now, the features of the Levantar wind were pretty well known. I mean, obviously anyone who sails the Strait of Gibraltar has to know about it, especially back in those days when you rely on wind power. And given that Gibraltar was at the time, relatively recently acquired enclave that the British had, and everywhere else around it was Spain, you can bet your bottom dollar that the Spanish knew exactly what a Levantar wind was and how it worked. And they were actually exploiting that fact to get the convoy through. The thing that tripped them up was that this particular Levantar wind, because obviously wind shift all the time, this particular one was considerably stronger than was normal, and it picked up over time. So they made it through the Straits, and then a few ships of the line and the convoy that they were escorting broke off and obviously entered effectively the wind shadow of the Iberian Peninsula, so they were okay. And the idea obviously was then that the escort fleet would hold the approaches just long enough for the convoy to get in, and then they'd follow themselves. And it was during that time that the Levantar really started to ramp up. I mean, it had been a fairly strong going through, but then it got really, really strong. And of course, with sailing ships of the day, if you don't have any particularly pressing reason for fighting it. If you get a really strong wind blowing, it's probably best to just run with it. Plus, as you can see here, and as you saw up top, the Levantar very often produces quite significant clouds and mist in the Straits of Gibraltar, which was what helped Nelson actually bypass the Spanish fleet to get back to Jervis. But that also meant that not only was the Spanish fleet being blown by a very strong wind, which it wasn't necessarily such a good idea to fight against, but they physically couldn't see all that much. So, you're acting very much on dead reckoning. It's like, you pass the Straits of Gibraltar at roughly X time, and you think you're probably traveling at about Y speed, but you don't have any visual references, land or whatever, to go by, because you're all in mist and fog and cloud. And so you break off the convoy at the appropriate time, and you think, well, we'll stay on station for X time. But then when X time expires, you're like, oh, hang on a minute, we're a lot further west than we thought. So it's not really a skill issue on the part of the Spanish. It's just they bargained for a standard Levantar, and they got a pretty darn strong one instead. And then combine that with the fog that it caused, and they didn't have any visual reference to realise what was going on until it was a little bit too late. Herr Fuschwansager asks, did any of the navies during the time frame of the Channel ever experiment with magnetic or other forms of proximity fusing for depth charges? It seems like an obvious improvement over manual depth settings, and the technology was used in mines and torpedoes, yet I don't think I've ever heard of anyone even trying this until after World War II. The answer is yes, some navies did experiment with magnetically fused depth charges. The US Navy, actually, the Mark 8 depth charge was supposed to be a primarily magnetically fused depth charge, and as a result was held to be considerably more effective than its immediate contemporaries. But it was also fitted with a standard hydrostatic pistol, just in case the magnetic detonator failed to work properly. And the single biggest issue was it proved very difficult to maintain the magnetic detonators and keep them in working order. Now, that might sound like a bit of a surprising thing, given that once they'd fixed the issues with them, you had magnetic detonators on mines and torpedoes, but you've got to remember that a mine is actually a relatively stable environment. Yes, it's sitting underwater, but the mine is designed to be long-term watertight at a fixed depth and just kind of sitting there bobbing around waiting for something to change. A torpedo lives most of its life at sea in a relatively climate-controlled submarine. Then you stuff it in a tube, and the torpedo, again, is hopefully watertight, and it's only got to make a journey of a few minutes before the magnetic detonator functions, and off goes the torpedo. Depth charges, on the other hand, have to live on the back of a small escort, usually heaving up and down in the ocean, periodically getting sprayed or covered with water that may be freezing cold, tepid, or even potentially slightly warm, in cold temperatures at night, warm temperatures during the day, freezing, tropical conditions, everything, you name it. And of course, since depth charges are much like torpedoes, one-shot weapons, but much smaller, much cheaper one-shot weapons, a tiny bit of water intrusion doesn't really make too much odds, because the thing that's going to detonate is the hydrostatic pistol, normally, which is obviously dependent on water pressure, not the fact that there's just water in there. Indeed, there is supposed to be water in there to exert the pressure to a certain degree, not obviously in some other parts. But all of this meant that what they found was the magnetic detonator on the Mark 8 depth charge was incredibly finicky and difficult to keep in functional condition. So while it was effective when it worked, that was the big caveat, when. Whereas a hydrostatic pistol was pretty much immune to almost all the effects of bouncing around on a ship. The other thing which the US introduced was the Mark 14, which was not quite, as far as I'm aware, in service for World War II. But the Mark 14 had a very basic sonar proximity fuse, because you can't use radar underwater, but it just used a little pinging sonar and used the Doppler effect as it got close to a contact to decide to detonate, which was considerably more reliable and therefore a much better option than the magnetic detonator, but as I said, they didn't introduce one quite in service. As far as I'm aware, the Germans never really experimented with it. The British also experimented with magnetic detonators in some depth charges, but had similar problems to the Americans. And I don't think the Italians or the French had any thoughts on those lines, but I haven't really looked into their ASW weapons quite as much. Sergeant Schultz asks, I was reading The Mighty Moo, the history of the Independence-class light carrier USS Cowpens, and at the start it describes the challenges of converting the Cleveland-class light cruiser hull into a carrier. One problem during modification was apparently a significant weight offset to starboard, which necessitated 87 tons of concrete being added to the port side in an attempt to balance out the list. My question is, why the concrete? When warship design in this period is focused a lot on weight management and squeezing value out of every available ton, was there really nothing useful that could be added instead of a dead weight to an already very cramped ship? Perhaps more quarters, a 5-inch mount, a 40mm mount, more 20mm mounts, an avgas tank, fresh water, a cafe, a promenade, or anything else? Unfortunately, it's one of those design decisions that just unfortunately just has to be taken, because 87 tons in the grand scheme of things doesn't sound like a lot, but actually, when you're trying to add 87 tons of anything to a ship, if it's going to be counterweight, you want it to be as dense as humanly possible to fill up the smallest amount of space. Now, theoretically, yeah, you could use something like lead, but lead is expensive. Concrete is cheap. So to give you some idea, you're looking at roughly 5 tons for a twin Bofors 40mm mount and about 10 tons for a quad, give or take a little bit. So 87 tons, you're talking about potentially adding 8 more quad 40mm and a twin. That's a lot of Bofors guns. And for them to be of any use, they've got to be mounted fairly high in the ship. And if you look at the layout of any Independence-class carrier, they're already fairly replete with Bofors. Now, of course, you wouldn't necessarily need all that many, because you'd also have to factor in the additional weight of the crew, the weight of the ammunition, and so on and so forth. But realistically, there just isn't enough space either aboard the ship for all those extra crew and the ammunition in the magazines, or for that many additional guns down the port side of the ship. And the same thing applies for the other AA mounts. You'd need a truly stupid number of Orlikans to add up to that much weight. Fewer 5-inch mounts, to be fair, but you look at an Independence class, where are you going to put a 5-inch? You really can't. The problem with anything that's got a liquid in it, like aviation gas or fresh water, is that eventually you're going to use it, and if you do use it up, then you now don't have anything in that tank, or you're going to contaminate it by letting seawater in. If you don't have anything in that tank, you now have a significant list to starboard, and if you fill it up, well, yeah, I'd love to see the aircraft that's running off avgas that's been taken from a tank that's regularly deluged in seawater. I wonder how long before the engine blocks up. And even to a certain extent with the AA mounts, because what happens when all the crew for those AA mounts go somewhere else in the ship? What happens when it's used up its ammunition, etc.? The nice thing about a concrete counterweight is that if you put 87 tons of concrete in there, it's going to be 87 tons of concrete in that location for pretty much forever until you break the ship up, which means that if you're trying to counterbalance a fixed weight that also hopefully isn't going anywhere, like, say, the island, then concrete or some other dense thing packed away in the lower reaches of the ship is pretty much your best bet. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a workable one. Mark Griffiths asks, what is your take on Meyer's argument that the defeat of Japan was not inevitable, and that with a couple of smaller changes, a different outcome could have resulted, such as a negotiated settlement? This is taken from his book, The Pacific War and Contingent Victory. I think, in perfect honesty, that whilst it's an interesting book to read, it's the kind of book that personally I would maybe borrow from a library and then return rather than actually spend my money on. I think to a certain degree that he's really splitting hairs, or if you want to be uncharitable, perhaps tilting at a windmill or a straw man when it comes to the whole premise, because the essential premise, or at least the impression I got from going through it, is that he takes the position that, look, some people have said Japan's defeat is inevitable. But he's treating that as an absolute, as in no scenario known to mankind would Japan ever be anything but defeated. And therefore it follows, some people have argued, that because Japan's defeat is inevitable, no particular battle is in any way decisive, because if that had been lost, then another battle would have come along and the Japanese would have ended up losing that one instead, if the Allies had lost Coral Sea, Midway, etc., etc. And so his assumption is that, well, if he can prove that there is a remote chance of Japan winning, or not even necessarily winning, at least not having to go down the route of absolute surrender and maybe getting terms, then therefore it is not inevitable that Japan would be defeated. And then he presents some scenarios where he thinks this could show some kind of difference. The thing is, I think anyone who says that anything in the field of human conflict is absolutely inevitable is varying degrees of wrong anyway, because nothing in that field is absolutely inevitable. There are always possibilities, but there's a difference of whether that's a practical possibility or not. So my position is that the defeat of Japan was practically inevitable. Yes, things could happen. I mean, the US could have been hit by, a quarter-sized meteor, or a quarter the size of the one that took out the dinosaurs. I'm pretty sure the US getting blasted off the map by a rock from the skies probably would have somewhat hampered the US war effort, and therefore Japan could have either sought terms or just done what it liked, as everyone else was very distracted by where the heck the asteroid came from. Likewise, if their biowarfare division somehow came up with a disease that targeted everybody with 100% lethality in a really long, 6-month incubation rate period when no one could detect it. Can you tell I've been playing Plague Inc. recently? That only happened to target people who weren't Asian. Well, yeah, wipe out the rest of the world population, and yeah, you win. These things, technically speaking, there is a non-zero chance of them possibly happening, and therefore, technically speaking, to say that the Japanese defeat is absolutely inevitable is incorrect. But they are so impractically improbable as to kind of, be pleading the case. And I think if I was going to pick two main flaws, other than what we've just discussed, with some of the scenarios he's presented in his book, is that some of the scenarios he presents, okay, very unlikely, but it's not unrealistic to think that there for a butterfly's flap of the wings, something like that might have gone down. But some of the other stuff he presents is pretty high fancy. So there's an invasion of Australia is one of his scenarios that might hold up the Allies long enough for some kind of negotiated settlement leading on the basis of war weariness and increasing body counts and everything. And I'm looking at that and thinking, I'm sorry, have you been to Australia? I mean, okay, I didn't go to the north of Australia, but I've been to enough of Australia and seen, pictures, footage, and heard descriptions from people who live in the northern part of Australia to know well enough that a Japanese invasion of Australia is not going to end well for them. There is some evidence that the Japanese did, in fact, actually land in Australia with small scouting and recon parties. The reason why there's only some evidence is that there's some evidence on the Japanese side that they were landed. There was no evidence that they were picked up. No one in Australia knows anything about them, so it's very likely that the Australian wildlife got them. So yeah, if you happen to be driving off-road in northern Australia and you finally come across some rather battered World War II era Japanese gear in places that you think it probably shouldn't be, let us know. Or else look out for several generations of very fat dingoes. Or maybe a crocodile with a taste for sushi. So yeah, any kind of large-scale Japanese invasion of Australia being a recipe for success for the Japanese, or at least less failure, I'm not buying that. I mean, apart from anything else, even if they had somehow managed to land several armies in northern Australia, the Japanese supply routes would have been hideously vulnerable. Even if this took place in a period before the Mark 14 was fixed, air power operating right on Australia's doorstep, And heck, at that point, the British and Dutch submarines that are based in Australia would have a bit of a field day because their torpedoes work. And there'd be a huge target of opportunity in these really long extended supply lines. And the other one, which I'm sure several of you have been screaming at your screens for a long time at this point, the atomic bomb. Wherever in the war Japan and the US and the Allies are in mid-45, summer 45, when the atomic bomb is ready, the Americans are going to start dropping nukes. And yeah, it might not go quite as well for some of the American troops because they might nuke Okinawa and then ask people to invade straight through the nuclear fireball and pool of radiation, a few hours after they drop the bomb, which probably isn't going to do anyone any favors. But the Americans would use them. And at the end of the day, that kind of puts a bit of a cutoff on the time limit for the Pacific part of World War II, because whether the Americans, as historically, bomb a couple of Japanese cities and make the Japanese surrender, or whether they wipe half a dozen Pacific islands off the face of the map with nuclear bombardment and then go and hit the Japanese cities with a few nukes, all that really changes is how many Americans are claiming for radiation sickness off of the V8, who will probably say it wasn't something to do with their service because that's what they're like. But the Japanese are inevitably doomed, unless, of course, one of your points of departure is the Manhattan Project fails. Now, but, that is either means that physics doesn't work the way you think it does, which is a little bit of a stretch for a supposedly plausible alternate history, or half a dozen of the finest minds in Western academia and research and Central and Western and Eastern European, because remember, a bunch of them escaped from Nazi Germany and headed over there. A bunch of them get randomly killed in a plane crash, so the bomb doesn't work and there's no one else to take their place. I mean, yeah, in theory, potentially, but that's really stretching things at that point. So, yeah, I think my overall conclusion, having talked about this probably for a lot longer than I thought I was going to, is yes, he is technically correct. It is not absolutely 100% inevitable that Japan would be defeated, but it is practically so. Peter Guy asks, in 1919, the surrendered German U-boat U-111 was sent to the United States along with a few other U-boats to tour the coastal waters and promote the sale of war bonds to help repay the cost of the US's participation in World War I. Do you know of any other notable examples of captured enemy warships being displayed by the victorious nation for similar reasons, or to show off the spoils of war to the nation as a sort of victory lap? Yeah, this wasn't actually particularly uncommon in the time period leading up to World War I, as long as you had something reasonably worth showing off. I mean, the Dutch, when they captured the big ship of the line, I think it was the Royal Charles at Chatham, on the Midway, and towed that home. She was a big showpiece for them until they discovered she was too deep drafted to easily get in and out of port. So they eventually dismantled her and used various components of her, and the stern is still there if you want to go and have a look at it. And based certainly on British records, if anything of any great substance was captured, whether that be because it was big and impressive, like the San Josef, the Spanish first rate, or working back time, something like the San Rosario, one of the Spanish Armada, big galleons, or something that was interesting, like a particularly fine French or Spanish frigate, or the American frigates captured in the War of 1812, President Chesapeake and Essex, particularly, of course, President, they would tend to have little sort of public open days whilst they were sitting in port waiting for valuation and assessment, and the Admiralty buying them or auctioning them off for various interests, so the prize money could be raised and things like this. And I suspect similar things would happen in French and Spanish ports if they managed to snag themselves a British or Dutch or whoever they were fighting that weak ship. The Chinese ships that the Japanese captured in the Sino-Japanese War and the Russian ships they captured in the Russo-Japanese War were certainly shown off in Japan. So yeah, it's pretty common. It's just that by the end of World War I and then going into World War II, the actual capture of enemy warships was becoming rarer and rarer. I mean, I'm pretty sure at least some elements of the High Seas Fleet would have been paraded around Britain had they not scuttled themselves in Scapa Flow, and in actual fact, that, which was perceived as a humiliation, was one of the minor, admittedly, but one of the reasons that the High Seas Fleet decided it didn't want to be on the surface anymore. Explicitly Implicit asks, nitromethane is used in numerous applications, such as in racing as a fuel additive to drastically increase an engine's performance. If this use had been known before or during World War II, would militaries have added it to their fuel in order to increase performance of engines in planes, torpedoes, and other equipment? As it's a bit of a fun question, I decided I'd have a little bit of fun myself. So yes, this is a mid-journey generated image that somebody sent me when I mentioned this question to them. So yeah, this is a very, very rare and obviously blatantly flagged and mentioned use of an AI image, just because I thought it would be funny. Warp speed. Well, it's supposed to be a Spitfire, a warp speed something in RAF colours with the little nitro flames and everything. But no, in all seriousness, if they had learned about nitromethane before or during World War II, oh yeah, of course they would be adding it to their fuel. I don't know in what quantities, because it would long-term have deleterious effects on the integrity of the machinery, I'm sure. But given that they had, boost settings and various other ways of temporarily uprating the power of aircraft, especially when the need arose, I'm pretty sure that even if it was only a kind of a limited in use for emergencies only, or limited to particular aircraft, perhaps high-flying recon aircraft that needed the power in the low oxygen atmospheres at a very high altitude or whatever, then yeah, I'm pretty sure they would be using it. The main question would be, how widespread is it and how easy is it for them to transport? Because nitromethane is not a pleasant chemical, especially with the storage mechanisms they've got of the day. I mean, can you imagine an aviation fuel fire if it managed to get to a tank full of nitro on an aircraft carrier or something? Not a pleasant thing to think about, but the power boost would obviously help carrier aircraft either take off over shorter distances or carrying more weight, so that would be quite useful. I don't think anyone's going to be sticking it into anything more substantial than aircraft or tank engines, though, much as the idea of a nitro-fueled warship is. Of course, steam turbines I don't think really mix. I don't think shoving nitromethane into the boilers is going to do anyone any good. Eric Van Dooting asks, why in so many sources are Japanese Daihatsu-class landing craft referred to as barges? When discussing similar ships in Allied navies, the terms landing craft or boats are almost always used. Is there anything particularly different about them that has resulted in this classification? Honestly, I think that's getting better these days. It's referred to more and more as a landing craft as time goes on. I think, to be honest, the main reason it was called a barge was because it's actually one of the very earliest examples of a proper amphibious landing craft, and when people were coming across it, they kind of looked at, obviously this example is fairly lightly loaded, so it's riding quite high, but people would look at the more general shape and they go, oh, it's kind of long, slow, round stern, diesel powered, relatively flat front, looks like a barge, because you see those on rivers and canals all the time in the Western world, certainly at that time, and even to a certain extent now. So they were like, oh, landing barge. And I guess through inertia, that's just kind of stuck. Whereas by the time the Allies were developing their own landing craft, they came up with all the fancy designations like LCT and LST and so forth, depending on the size. And, if you're introduced and told, oh, what's this? Oh, it's a landing craft. It's in the name, landing craft tank, or LCP, landing craft personnel, or whatever. It's like, oh, okay, it was a landing craft, fair enough, whatever, and on goes the inertia. So yeah, I just think it's early World War II inertia being carried forward, and perhaps maybe in some cases a kind of a subconscious prejudice against stuff that the Japanese invented, because you could theoretically go, oh, well, this is a landing craft, this is a landing ship. This, however, is just a barge. Kind of mild pejorative use there, but I suspect that's somewhat rarer than just those initial observations winding up it somehow in obviously US Navy reports, and then people reading and going, oh, well, the troops called it a barge, so I guess it's a barge. Vintage Car History asks, AFFF, or Aqueous Film Forming Foam, has been a staple of DC, or damage control lockers, in the US Navy for many decades. Who actually came up with the idea of fighting fires with soap, and how did, if it did, spread to other navies? Well, with the obvious caveat that I'm not a firefighting chemical foam engineer, nor am I really a specialist in post-1950s stuff, which is when AFFF comes in the, I think it's the 60s. The idea of a foam firefighting chemical spray, whatever you want to call it, goes back almost to the beginning of the 20th century because, well, people started using oil and other hydrocarbons in greater amounts, and that inevitably meant there were oil fires, and people very rapidly found out that spraying an oil fire with water was not a good way of either putting out the fire or indeed of prolonging your own lifespan. So you had to figure out, well, how do you get rid of oil fires? Now, of course, if you have an oil well on fire, you can just blow it up with sufficient explosives. Unfortunately, if you are on a ship that has just been hit by something explosive and you now have an oil or petrol fire going, the idea of piling even more explosives into the area to blow out that fire is probably not going to earn you any medals. So they had to come up with something else. And various people in both the 1900s for commercial oil firefighting use, and then in I think the 20s and 30s for use aboard places like ships, came up with various foaming firefighting, I guess, surfactants, chemical mixes or whatever. And that's why when you see, videos of firefighting being undertaken in the Second World War aboard aircraft carriers and so forth, there's a mixture of things in play. I mean, there's obviously just a lot of seawater being pumped at stuff because, well, you're in the sea. As long as you have a pump going, whether that be a portable pump or a shipboard pump, it's essentially free, unlimited water. But you will also occasionally see the application of foam-based firefighting techniques to varying degrees of success. Of course, there were limits to what this could do, how you would safely apply it, and how much fire, I think it's called knockback is the term, you'd get out of it. And so, obviously, people kept developing newer and improved ways of doing it until you eventually get AFFF foam in, as I say, I think the 60s. And yes, that did spread because it is tremendously effective. Toxic, long-term damage to your health, yes, but also ridiculously effective at killing fires. And so in areas where the sheer effectiveness of something is perhaps a little bit more considered for its use rather than, strictly speaking, the health benefits, i.e. something like the military, AFFF did spread very widely. For example, the Royal Navy uses, or used to, at least until very recently, used AFFF in its firefighting activities. Much as in the same way that, halon fire extinguishers have been banned for civilian use, at least in the UK and other areas I've been to for a very, very, very long time. But as far as I'm aware, halon extinguishers are either still in use or up until very recently have still been in use in various critical installations, not just military ones, but also things like some major data centers and so forth, stuff where, again, the effects of losing the thing override the more typical health and safety concerns associated with something that they've restricted from civilian use. Reichspeer Minister asks, with hindsight, what could the US Navy have done better in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor in terms of recovery and repair? And why weren't some of the heavily damaged battleships converted to aircraft carriers? Well, in regard to the carrier issue, the US already had the first tranche of Essexes having been laid down, so they knew they had a bunch of fleet carriers coming in. And, well, look at how long it took to just refit some of the heavily damaged battleships, whereas carrier conversion would have involved not just essentially a similar level of work for a refit, but still further work because you would have to be removing stuff that was still intact, like the gun turrets, the barbettes, the full conversion works, and removing chunks of armour, etc. So it would have taken longer and been even more expensive. And at the end of it, given that you would be converting standard type battleships, you'd end up with essentially fractionally longer equivalents of Bern, or potentially the world's most impractical escort carrier. And so given that it would actually cost more and take longer to do that than just rebuild them to vaguely modernised standards and send them out for shore bombardment duty, you'd actually get more use out of the battleships as shore bombardment and backstops against Japanese battleships coming to play, like you ended up with Surigao Strait, than you would ever get out of a Colorado class or similar with a flight deck slapped on top. But with all that said, even with hindsight, there's not a huge amount more that the US Navy could have done for recovery and repair of the ships. I mean, they got on it, as I did a 3-part video series on, they got on it pretty darn quickly, and then they kept going as much as resources allowed, bearing in mind they also had to clear the rest of Pearl Harbor for war duties. They were expanding the dry docking facilities, expanding the base generally, and of course there were ships coming and going, rearming, refueling, being repaired. So they had to do all the salvage work on top of that. I think the main things, if you were going to say, okay, with hindsight, this could have been improved, the main things would have been to actually have stocks of salvage equipment to hand, because that was, especially in the early days, one of the larger bottlenecks was just simply they didn't have enough diving equipment and enough modern diving equipment and so on and so forth, workshop space, etc. They had more people available who were qualified than very quickly than they necessarily had equipment that they could use. And, and even for things like, saving people in the upturned hulls of ships with, cutting equipment and so forth. Yes, they had some, but you could, in theory, make an argument that would say, look, if you're expecting to forward deploy the fleet to Pearl Harbor, even if you're not expecting an attack like you get at Pearl Harbor, you should be expecting the fleet to go out and potentially fight a Japanese fleet and have a bunch of very heavily damaged ships return in immediate need of maintenance, potentially a bit like Seydlitz at Jutland, ships getting back just about being kept afloat by superhuman effort and then just sinking in harbour as soon as they get there, at which point you probably should have had somewhat more salvage and cutting equipment on hand, which might have accelerated that earlier process, but I think realistically that's probably all you could ask for. Alex Moskowitz asks, in the 1900 to 1950 period, what was the ratio of the cost of a dry dock to the cost of a battleship? You've mentioned how a barrier to larger ships was the lack of dry docks that could fit them, but part of me thinks that the cost of digging a few holes in the ground, albeit very large holes, should be a tiny fraction of the cost of what was, at the time, the largest and most complex machine on the planet. Unfortunately, it's one of those sliding figures that, there is no one definitive answer to. At a very, very basic level, it can come down to what are you digging into? The type of material you have to excavate, and therefore what kind of digging equipment and how long and how difficult it's going to be can massively change the price of digging a dry dock. But on top of that, there's a whole load of other problems that you've got to consider when it comes to extending your dry dock facilities to cope with larger ships. First of all is, do you actually have the space? Because most dry docks tend to be, certainly by the early 20th century, built into pre-existing harbour facilities. And so if you want to extend either those or a slipway, well, there might be really inconvenient things like roads, light railways, and whole buildings in the way. And that's assuming that the landscape underneath them is otherwise suitable for it. So demolishing or relocating those is going to add dramatically to your costs. Additionally, there's the actual dry dock facilities themselves. So you can see here with this rather large dry dock that's holding 2 standard type battleships. On the bottom left, there's the rail mounted crane. Now that will run all the way down both sides. You can actually see there's another crane on the right-hand side there. And that railhead will go around the end of the dry dock. And in a large dock facility, those rails may also run onto other dry docks so that the cranes can be moved around. So if you're going to extend the dry dock lengthwise, you're going to have to rip up all of that rail track and relay it further back, again with the associated costs of moving and potentially also, stuff that you might be impinging on further back. And then it gets even more complicated if you need to widen the dry dock, because a dry dock that is relatively short for what you're trying to build will probably have been built to accommodate the beam of ships of the period it was built in. So if you're building a much longer ship, it's necessarily going to be a little bit wider. You may need to dig out the side of the dry dock, and then you've got to relocate all that infrastructure on the side. That's particularly problematic because you've also got the costs of the pumps, and those pumps are not small and then they are not cheap. They're big, hefty things, and you've got to supply them with a lot of power. So if you're going to excavate the side of a dry dock to widen it as well, then you're either going to have to be forced to go in one particular direction, i.e. the side where those pumps are not, or if you can't do that, then you're going to have to either relocate the pump houses entirely or potentially build brand new ones and scrap the old ones. Additionally, if you're widening it, you're going to need a brand new caisson and or gates. And of course, if you're extending your existing facilities, it's not just about digging it through the rock or soil or whatever it is you happen to be basing the dry dock within. You've also got to remove the stonework if you've got a stone dry dock, or you've got to hack through the reinforced concrete if you've got a concrete dry dock. So all of that is extra work and cost. And with all that, you might be thinking, well, it might just be easier to build a new dry dock. And yeah, it very well might be easier and cheaper just to build a new dry dock because, then you don't have to worry about a lot of what we just mentioned. However, you then have more excavating to do. And of course, you've got to find a plot of land close to your existing dockyard facilities that's big enough to accommodate your new, longer dry dock. And then while you don't have to pay the costs of removing or relocating all the infrastructure like the pump houses and the rail lines and the cranes and so forth, you do still have to pay the cost of new build to extend the rail heads to your new dry dock, to line an entire new dry dock, to build a brand new caisson or new gates, to install new pump houses and pumps, to run the extremely large power cables and high capacity power generators that you need, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, just digging a hole in the ground in which you can fit a ship, that is cheap. All the other associated stuff, that makes it a whole lot more expensive. And hopefully you can appreciate, depending on what exactly you want to do, it can massively change the costs that are involved, from, a third of the price of a battleship to 2 or 3 times the price of a battleship, all depending on complexity. And then, of course, you've got the fact that this one dry dock that you've done doesn't really help you all that much, because if you're going to build a class of ships, you need ideally a lot more than one dry dock. If you're, let's say, you're building a class of 4 battleships, then at minimum, really, you want 2 that can handle that class of ship. And then if you're anything other than, say, Germany with a very limited coastline, you're going to need considerably more than 2. So if you're the British, you're going to want at least 2, possibly 3 dry docks that can handle ships of that size in the UK. You're going to want at least 1 in the Mediterranean region. So that means extending either Gibraltar or Malta, or building a floating dry dock and sending it over there. And again, do you actually have the space in those areas? You're going to need at least 1, ideally 2 in the Far East. And suddenly now the costs are spiraling up and up and up. And if you're the US, you probably want at least 2 on the East Coast and at least 2 on the West Coast. And whether you have on the West Coast, do you do 2 on the West Coast and maybe 1 in Pearl Harbor, or do you do 2 in Pearl Harbor and 1 on the West Coast, depending on the time period you're looking at? So suddenly you're looking at least 5, possibly 6 dry docks minimum. And even if each individual dry dock is relatively cheap, let's say you're building new adjacent to existing dockyard facilities, you've got the space, you've got the land, it's relatively close for connections, etc., let's say, even if it's only costing you a third to half the cost of a battleship, by the time you've built enough dry docks to actually have a viable dry dock infrastructure, it's now cost you as much as 2 or 3 battleships, and that's being fairly generous, and on top of that you still have to worry about, do you have the slipways, and so forth. Avoid Shisnos asks, during World War II, the British struggled to build enough merchant ships to fill the voracious needs of various theatres. Were there efforts to purchase ships from the US or any other shipbuilding territories, and if not, why not? Well, everyone who could build ships was building ships, so various, dominions at that point, so Canada, Australia, etc., they were building ships, but you've got to remember that the vast majority of shipping in the merchant convoys of World War II is not owned by the government. It's owned by private entities who have been contracted to ship goods. Now, they might be under government insurance because of wartime, and the government is paying out when ships are sunk, but at the end of the day, the government doesn't own the vast majority of the transport ships out there. Therefore, the British government isn't going to be really in the market to purchase vast fleets of merchant transports. The insurance money that's paid to the private companies would mean that private companies might be in a position to try and buy merchant ships from elsewhere. Now, obviously, things do change a little bit as time goes on and mass production of Victory ships and Liberty ships continue. However, when it comes to the problem of we don't have enough merchant ships, it's far easier and cheaper to just charter ships. And you would see with a lot of this, let's say the Atlantic convoys, that even before the US is officially involved in the war, there are plenty of US flagged ships and neutral flagged ships taking part in those convoys because, well, it's an opportunity to trade. And yes, there is a risk that they will get torpedoed, but that's, again, where insurance, either private or government-backed, comes into play. And for the UK government, it's much cheaper to do that, because if you can charter a ship, then you pay the charter cost for that voyage with the promise of insurance backing it if the ship is lost. And if the ship isn't lost, then all you've paid is the charter cost of that vessel, and you got the cargo, and you didn't have to pay for the crew. Well, indirectly you are, because you're paying the charter cost, but you're not having to directly salary the crew. And all the other stuff, maintenance and everything, is on the head of whoever it is you got the ship from for that period. You can continue, of course, to charter the ship for as long as it stays afloat, but those charter costs will remain well below the threshold of the price of actually purchasing the blasted thing for quite a long time. Now, that's not to say the UK government didn't purchase ships from external sources. They obviously did, but it wasn't a general case of we need to throw merchant ships into the convoys, therefore we're going to buy a bunch of them, because as I said, you can just charter enough of them, or once the US is involved in the war, they're doing it anyway for you. But there were some specific needs, essentially for military transports and so forth, and obviously those would be purchased. Greg M. In Drydock 314, around 26 minutes and 33 seconds, when speaking on good sailing qualities, you touched briefly on the difference in the length to beam ratio between a French 80-gunner and a British 74-gunner. Agility versus speed seems to have been one difference, but were there other significant differences that affected the two navies' different choices in what might be called their standard third-rate ships? Well, generally speaking, in the realms of ship design in the 18th century, and obviously going into the early 19th, the French liked to be at least half a step ahead of everybody else in terms of sheer size and firepower, because, in the earlier portions of the 18th century, the standard third-rate ship of the line, or the kinds of ships you'd expect to see in battle, as the various ratings had just about been codified, were considerably smaller. So 50, 55, 56, 58 gun ships, 64s being a relatively decent standard, were kind of par for the course. And then, roughly speaking, about halfway through that century, the French start showing up with this new innovation en masse, the 74-gun ship of the line, which is considerably more powerful, not only because it carries more guns, but also because it carries heavier guns on its lower gun deck. And after a while, and having captured a few of them, the British adopt it, and now everyone's on 74s. And then a decade or so later, the French start showing up with the 80-gun ship of the line. And you see a similar kind of thing up at the top end at first rates, where you have the Ocean-class, which, as I mentioned before, for a good long while was some of the biggest and meanest ships on paper when it came to first rates. And the same is true even to a certain extent down at frigate level. Essentially what had happened was that the French had looked at the pattern of various battles they'd fought with the British, and during the 18th century concluded that for whatever reason, they generally weren't coming off the best in a lot of them. Now, obviously, they did have victories, and they did have stalemates, but broadly speaking, if you put two similar ships up against each other, one British and one French, the British ship on average would tend to be the winner. The ratio was a lot closer during the period when the French Navy was a royal navy than it was in the Revolutionary era, for reasons I've discussed multiple times before. But the French therefore concluded that, well, we need some kind of edge. They weren't necessarily going to get that edge in terms of the bulk of experienced sailors and commanders, although they did have some. And so they thought, well, instead we'll just have faster and more powerful ships, and that will give us an edge. And to be perfectly honest, if the French Navy had continued under royal command with its cadre of relatively experienced officers, and they hadn't had the rather odd push from aristocratic officers in the mid to late part of the 18th century before the French Revolution that actually also did in somewhat for the professionalism of the French officer corps, not as much as the Revolutionary era executions, but some, then I can see it working out for them, at least until the Royal Navy adapts and starts matching them again. But it, having the longer ship with the more and heavier guns did give you a faster vessel, so speed versus agility definitely is a thing. But one of the other things was that you were having to pay for that in certain ways, specifically in cost of maintenance and how long your ship could stay out there, because for a two-decker, the length needed for an 80-gunner was pushing what could be done with shipbuilding technology in the 18th century. And that meant that obviously the ship's hull would flex and it would work and seams would open up and you get, water intrusion and rot, and the ship would very gradually work itself apart much faster than the slightly shorter 74 would. Now, for the French Navy, which a lot of the time was fighting from a position of we're in port, the British have come after us, we sail out, we fight them. Obviously, again, not all the time, especially in the Royalist era, but more often than not, this wasn't so much of a problem. So they could launch their fleet. It would therefore have a speed and firepower advantage. They could go out, they could engage in battle, they'd hopefully win, and then they'd come back and they'd repair their ships. For the British, who were more often on long-term deployments like blockade duty or far-flung ventures on the other side of the planet, this was not such a good thing. They needed a ship that could hold itself together for years on end with relatively minimal maintenance, and hence the choice of the 74. And you even see this reflected when various ships from either side are captured. The French 80-gunners, when they were brought into British service, they were roomier, they were faster, they had more firepower, so they were very popular commands, at least initially. And then 3-4 months down the line, when your little solid 74s all around you are perfectly watertight and your 80 gunner is, visibly warping and a bit damp inside, suddenly it's somewhat less popular. And so the combat capabilities of them were very much appreciated, but the fact you had to cycle them back into dock and conduct rather expensive maintenance, some considerably more frequently, made them very unpopular in British service, at least if you were a dockyard worker or the Admiralty, or indeed someone who had to do any kind of long-term station deployment. You could in some ways almost view the French approach to ship design generally, but also particularly with the 80-gunner, almost like the Italians with the Littorios. In almost any other navy, a battleship that shoots out its barrels in 120 to 150 shots and has, relatively speaking, minimal fuel capacity would be completely unacceptable. But for the Italians, who are operating at relatively short ranges and are only out for relatively short periods of time before returning to the main home base, that kind of issue is an acceptable compromise in order to get the speed and firepower they want. But it is very much a situational thing. Robert Knapp asks, if Germany had been allowed to retain a few of the Königs or the Hindenburg or some of their older battle cruisers or whatever in 1918, could they have been modernised in the interwar period into vessels that were any use to Germany in World War II? The answer feels obvious, perhaps it being the Bayern and Baden, but I don't know. Well, could they have been modernised? Yes, absolutely. I mean, they managed to modernise their pre-dreadnoughts, so they certainly have the capability of doing so. Now, in terms of which one would have been any use to the Germans in World War II, actually, whilst the Badens or Bayerns on paper look relatively attractive, they're fairly well protected, they've got 15-inch guns, good battle line units. The problem is the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine in World War II, really doesn't need a battle line unit. Certainly not a slow battle line unit. That is fundamentally the issue, because a modernised Bayern or Baden, or both, is still not going to have the firepower or the protection, for that matter, to stand up to something like Nelson or Rodney. Nelson or Rodney are going to be faster, unless you do something really insane like a Italian Cavour-style rebuild. And even then, other fast capital ships exist. And it would cost a huge, huge amount of money, and you're starting from a position of ships that, broadly speaking, are comparable to a Queen Elizabeth or in terms of protection and firepower, but are very definitely not comparable in terms of speed. And only really the modernised QEs had a use in World War II on the front lines, and that was mostly because they had retained their intermediate speed, and the Revenge class and Malaya and Barham, unless circumstances were really desperate, generally were on second line duties. So even modernised, without, as I say, Italian style massive rebuilds, the Badens or Bayerns would be pretty much second line ships, but fairly big and threatening second line ships, which would mean they'd attract all the attention and not really have the capability of getting away from it, which isn't a good thing. I think, however, if they'd been allowed to retain Hindenburg and Der Flinger, those would have been objectively, of the ships they actually completed, the most useful for the Germans in the Second World War. Obviously, they start out with a considerably higher top speed. They're not too shabby in the realm of protection. And, so therefore, refitting them to give them a slight additional boost of speed, the way the Japanese did with the Congos, is a significantly more reasonable proposition. So you'd get a fast ship, something that's on a par with some of the slower heavy cruisers speed-wise. They've got good firepower, more than enough firepower to deal with any cruiser. And yes, having 8 to 12-inch guns is going to put them at a disadvantage as compared to the Bayern or Baden's 15-inch guns. But honestly, again, you would want to be using these a little bit like how the Germans historically used the Scharnhorsts, and in actual fact, at that point, you can possibly see where I'm going with this. If you've got a modernised Hindenburg and a modernised Der Flinger, and you've got Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, you now have a 4-ship fast unit very early on in the war. And yeah, individually, their firepower is not enough to take on even an old ship like Malaya, but 4 of them, you can either concentrate a lot of firepower operating together, or you can split up across the Atlantic and cause an awful lot of havoc in a way that's a lot more cost-effective than a single Bismarck, because a Baden or Bayern would just be hunted down and killed because of their slow speed. And in actual fact, even comparing them to something like the Deutschlands, a refitted Hindenburg or Der Flinger is going to be most likely slightly faster. And even if not, even if they keep the original design speed, well, look at the Battle of River Plate. You'd have 2 extra guns. They'd be slightly larger guns, plus a considerably larger secondary battery, and armour that is, for the most part, going to reject even Exeter's 8-inch shells. So a refitted Hindenburg or Der Flinger at the Battle of River Plate, unsurprisingly, is going to do fantastically better than Graf Spee did. So, yeah, in terms of what ship you'd want for the Kriegsmarine, those would be my choice. Michael Gilson asks, in response to a Drydock question about whether the Japanese had anything like Fritz X, you mentioned they had an infrared Homer under development. With such an early infrared weapon, would they or anyone else with a similar one have been wise to flood the target with unguided rockets armed with incendiary or high explosive warheads first to help mark it for the guided weapon and also help suppress enemy defences? Yes, that would absolutely be of considerable help. The only caveat to that, of course, with the Japanese in particular, was that if they had the capability of regularly smothering American targets with high explosive rockets or incendiary bombs or whatever, they would probably be doing that rather than trying to invent standoff cruise weapons and guided bombs and so forth. And, of course, this is an early IR seeker, so from the testing that they did, and, well, to be honest, even from the infrared-seeking weapons that entered service with various forces on both sides of the Cold War in the 50s and 60s, there was still the problem of them being relatively crude and just essentially locking onto the biggest heat source that happened to be roughly close to the centre of their sensors. So, early sidewinders going, the sun, I shall destroy this, and heading off into space, or trying to, obviously, and then running out of power and so forth. But, when they were testing it, they found that, random heat sources up to and including particularly reflective patches of the sea, when on a particularly sunny day, could decoy the missile. So they were looking primarily actually at operating the thing at night, when in theory the only major heat sources should be shipping at sea. But equally, if someone else, like say the Americans, had infrared homing weaponry, then it would be a good idea to initially maybe smother the target in something that was on fire or set it on fire, and then the bomb would help finish it off. Or the flip side to that is, if you're under attack by these kind of infrared homing weapons, then having little rafts or floats packed with flares that you could drop off the back, like essentially a ship-sized version of the flares that aircraft use to decoy infrared weapons, that would be an option that probably would attract the attention of the homing weapon. Lord Nelson asks, during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the South China Sea harboured some of the largest pirate fleets in history, with crew numbers going into the tens of thousands, yet European naval presence seems to have been quite limited. Why is that? Partly because the heyday of the Chinese pirate fleets happens to coincide with the peak of the Napoleonic Wars, at which point most of the European navies had other things to do across the other side of the planet. Also, the Chinese pirate fleets, whilst large in terms of numbers of ships and obviously numbers of men, were primarily operating small, effectively coastal craft. They could go out into the deep ocean, but the average Chinese pirate junk was a relatively small vessel, relatively minimally armed, and those guns were also fairly light. So they're essentially a mass coastal warfare setup, and they're mostly interested in raiding and pillaging Chinese, Vietnamese, and other nearby coastlines and their trade, which, as far as the Europeans are concerned, is not their problem. Because as long as they leave the European trade ships alone, which are obviously deep water ships heading to the main harbours, which generally the pirates tended to leave alone, both the harbours and the big ships, then, well, that's a problem for someone else to deal with. The local government, if they've got a pirate problem, they can fight it. And the Chinese government was fighting it. Their fleets weren't doing particularly well a lot of the time, but there was an ongoing existing campaign by Chinese forces to try and deal with it, particularly obviously the provincial fleets. Eventually, as the pirates got bolder and also as the Napoleonic War started to wind down, the Europeans did start to get a little bit more interested, because the occasional European ship would be captured. The Portuguese would therefore get involved because it was one of their ships that were captured. But then when you look at the forces the Portuguese deployed, a frigate and a few brigs, it kind of tells you the difference in firepower that you're looking at. And you see that again in the Opium Wars with, Chinese war junks going up against what's essentially the East India Company's random collection of enforcement vessels, and not coming off the best for it. And so, when big East Indiamen show up and the occasional other European warship, the Chinese pirate fleets know to stay well away, because they're not going to win that fight in the slightest. That is the case of, you could launch 50 ships at a large frigate or a small ship of the line, and the single vessel is actually has a pretty good chance of coming out the winner. And that's assuming that everybody is just happy to hurl themselves at it, rather than, the first 10 ships get utterly annihilated and then the rest of the pirates will go, we're going off elsewhere. And by the time the European Napoleonic Wars are truly over, and perhaps Britain or any of the other countries with a major interest over in that area could seriously think about sending large-scale forces over to just deal with them once and for all, the problem had already largely been dealt with by internal Chinese politics. And if you want some idea of what we're talking about in terms of size and firepower, if you look at one of the major surrenders of Chinese pirates, they actually tabulate how many junks they surrendered and how many cannon were on those junks. And when you divide one by the other, you realize that on average, these ships are only carrying 4 to 6 cannon apiece. And they're small ships, so you're talking about the equivalent of 4, 6, maybe 9-pounder guns. Not really a serious threat even to a particularly bolshy East Indiaman. Ort Kaiser asks, it seems to me that big ships cope better with bad weather than small ships, but what properties exactly ensure that big ships cope better with bad weather, and what size of these properties is necessary for a ship to operate in any weather? It's a whole combination of factors. Bigger ships obviously have considerably greater power output, and that helps them fight currents considerably more, and wind-blown currents and wave currents, etc. And yes, of course, it has a bigger ship to push around. This is true. However, just the sheer power behind those propellers will help, because the ship might not be going anywhere or going anywhere fast, but there's still an awful lot of force in the water to direct the ship where you want. Whereas you might have a small, really fast vessel, but considering the sheer mass of the sea that might be fighting against you, the fact that your small ship can go 30 knots and the battleship can only go 18 in, say, the pre-dreadnought period, that's not necessarily going to help you all that much, because your absolute power output might still be considerably less, and therefore you're just going to get shoved. And on that related note, sheer mass. Waves weigh an awful lot, because water is quite heavy, quite dense, and therefore a lighter ship is going to be much more easily thrown about than a heavier ship, which has its own inertia and so forth. Now, of course, this all depends on the scale of the weather. Another thing you have to factor in is wavelength. An awful lot of storms, the wavelength of the waves, i.e. the distance from crest to crest or trough to trough, is such that if you are in a smaller vessel, you may find yourself entirely going up the slope of a wave or down the slope of a wave, or broached over the crest and so forth. A larger vessel, more typically, will be at least partially on one wave and another, which does actually stress the hull a little bit more, because you're going to get a lot of hogging and sagging, but overall it means that the ship is going to remain somewhat more level, assuming it's sailing into the path of the waves rather than going broadside on. But as I said, scale is important, because yes, this is actually USS Vermont in an actual storm, and eventually the size of the waves will get to a point where it can start throwing about even considerably larger vessels in a manner similar to the way that it would be throwing around smaller vessels. And at that point, weirdly enough, assuming that you can stay upright, because the sheer energy involved can just flip a smaller ship very easily, but assuming you can stay upright, a smaller ship might actually have a slightly better time of it in a storm of this scale, because the waves are going to be so big and the wavelength is going to be so long that its journey up, over and down a wave might actually take a considerable time, and therefore actually seem slightly less violent. And of course, being a lighter ship, and smaller ships tend to be a little bit more buoyant, because their sectional density tends to be a little bit less, because obviously they're not carrying big masses of armor, and also they have less inertia. They can actually ride a roller coaster of waves, which isn't particularly pleasant to be in, but is slightly better than, as you can see here, with huge amounts of water being shipped over the bow, and then when this wave passes, it is going to go plunging down, and its inertia will carry it deep into the next wave, which can actually be considerably more dangerous, because now you've got an awful lot of water above the decks. So it does the flip side, of course, is this kind of weather could, as I said, very easily just snap or flip a smaller ship if you're unlucky, and at that point you're gone. But where the threshold is of transitioning over from small ship, you're always going to get tossed around, to large ship, you're only really vulnerable to the absolute largest weather systems, depends very much on where you are in the world. So the North Sea, for example, very well known for large waves, but a storm of X mile an hour winds in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, in the North Sea, in the Caribbean, in the Western Pacific, where it's very shallow, or in the deep waters of the mid-Pacific, and so on and so forth, the same kind of storm system is actually going to result in very different wave conditions. So, unfortunately, there is no one kind of golden size of, okay, if you are longer than this, or you mass more than this, you're going to have a much better time of it in a storm than another vessel, because that threshold is moving very much depending on exactly how weather systems in that area play out in wave height, wavelength, etc., etc. There was one comment from a sailor who was in the North Sea in World War II that kind of speaks to this point, in that he knew it was a really, really bad storm, because, well, he was on a destroyer, so it was just bouncing up and down, as it always did. But then he looked out and he saw a King George V class battleship, and he said, normally in a storm in the North Sea, you see a battleship like that smashing its way through wave after wave after wave, and it's all very spectacular and everything, and probably not brilliant for anybody who's exposed on the ship, but the ship is powering through the waves rather than the waves powering through and over the ship. And then he looks out and sees this battleship, and in this case, like with Vermont here, he sees an entire King George V class riding up one side of a wave, cresting, and then going back down the other. And that's when he's like, yeah, this is a serious storm. And I believe there's a video clip I've shown in a few dry docks as well of, I think it might actually even be that particular storm, where you see entire aircraft carriers disappearing behind the crests of waves and then re-emerging. Pedden Harley asks, just how massive an advantage did geography grant to the US in the Pacific War? The Pearl Harbor attack was at the limits of Japanese capabilities in 1941. Just how much larger a fleet and fleet train would the Japanese have needed to try and take and hold Hawaii? What about invading the mainland US? Would a fleet the size the US actually had in 1945 have been up to the task? Presumably in reverse. It was quite the considerable advantage, because, well, you can, here's a map. Now, one thing you'll notice is that pretty much, not quite, but pretty much all of the islands which you can stage from and hop around are in the Western Pacific. Now, yeah, there's things like Easter Island and the Galapagos in the Eastern Pacific, but realistically speaking, between Hawaii and the US, there really isn't all that much of anything, which means that as long as somebody is holding Hawaii, obviously in this case the United States, there's essentially a gigantic water-filled gap, it's kind of a moat, I guess, that's defending the US West Coast from being attacked by anything. Whereas in the Western Pacific, you can do, well, what both sides did. The Japanese initially grabbing a bunch of islands and then basing out of them, and then the Americans taking those islands and basing out of them instead. And then, of course, you've got Australia. And, for anyone who knows anything about Australia, Australia is not exactly small. The distances involved just to get from port to port in Australia are quite considerable. But even basing yourself in Australia, which obviously the Allies could do, you are much, much, much closer to Japan. There is no similar place that you can base yourself out of to attack the main part of the continental United States. In terms of attacking Hawaii, though, the Japanese don't necessarily need a much larger fleet and fleet train to attack it. They could do it with what they had. The problem is, one, persuading the Japanese army to part with enough troops, and obviously getting the Japanese army's navy on side, because they've got some of the bigger and better transports. But two, it would be a kind of a one and done deal, because remember, when it comes to things like refueling at sea, etc., and the fleet train, that's assuming you're coming back. Now, if you wanted to have a large Japanese invasion fleet heading to Hawaii on the premise that those ships also should be capable of sailing back if the mission had to be aborted, that's another matter. Yes, at that point you would need a massively larger fleet train. However, if you're essentially doing a double or nothing, where you send the entire fleet at Hawaii and the troop ships land, and the warships, the battleships, the cruisers, the destroyers, and the aircraft carriers sit offshore and do their best to support you, and as I said, double or nothing, you win or you die, you can do that pretty much with what the Japanese had at the time, because the fleet train is enough to either fuel a good chunk of the fleet to go attack Pearl Harbor and then come back again, or just go there, attack Pearl Harbor, and refuel enough to keep them in combat operations for a little while off of Pearl Harbor. But essentially at that point, what you're bargaining on is that you're going to capture a good chunk of Hawaii, including at least one major port, ideally Pearl Harbor itself, and even more ideally capturing the fuel farms intact. And even if the Americans manage to sabotage them, you at least have a safe harbor from which you can base yourself whilst your tanker fleet heads back to Japan to restock and then come back to fuel you up. If American resistance is able to stop you from accomplishing those goals and you don't have anywhere secure to anchor, and then all the campaign runs on past a week or two, then you're in trouble, because now if you're losing the ground war, despite all your air support from the carriers and bombardments from the warships and so on and so forth, you now don't have the fuel capacity to head back. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that if by some miracle that gambit actually works out, and then, let's say, ideal case scenario, it's a massive, stunning surprise attack, and the Japanese troops manage to land in or around Pearl Harbor and capture it, and they manage to drive off US forces before they can set fire to the fuel dumps. And even if they don't capture all of Hawaii, they're at least able to establish a perimeter around Pearl Harbor that is secure, so that the Japanese fleet can come in and refuel and rest, etc. And then eventually either the Hawaiian chain is surrendered, or the Japanese land reinforcements are managed to take it, or whatever. So, a little bit of hand waving, but let's assume the Japanese managed to do this. They're essentially just resetting the problem if they want to attack the mainland US. For one thing, the Japanese don't have anywhere near the transport capacity, or I think maybe even the men generally, to actually invade the continental United States practically. But even if you just wanted to do some kind of performative expedition to raid or attack some cities or the Panama Canal or something, you're essentially just taking the problem of the attack on Pearl Harbor and transferring it east. So even if you hold a pretty much intact Pearl Harbor, you're down to the same thing of, yes, you can theoretically stage a force out to attack or temporarily invade a portion of the US West Coast, but you're pretty much again going to be relying on getting there and succeeding, and then being able to at least pause for a bit while the tankers shuttle back and forth and refuel you to get back. And if you fail, there's a good chunk of your fleet that won't make it back because they won't have the fuel. Now, could a fleet the size that the US had in 1945 do this operation in reverse? So we're assuming the geographical setup is switched. The US certainly has considerably better logistics to sail from somewhere like Hawaii across the distance involved to get over to the US coastline, or not US coastline in this case. So yes, the US fleet could deploy itself if you're on an alternate Earth where they're deploying from the Hawaiian Islands to attack the west coast of the not US. That would be possible, and yes, they would have the fleet trained to be able to make it back again if it didn't work out. Of course, that's ignoring the larger problem of, can you actually physically transport enough men across the Pacific to meaningfully invade a country the size of the United States? I suspect probably not. Dylan Bartlett asks, obsolete weapons used during World War II. I've seen multiple mentions of weapons such as old British rifled muzzle-loading guns, pom-pom guns, and an assortment of old Krupp guns still in service during World War II. Is there any truth to these, and if so, did any see combat use other than the Norwegian sinking of Blucher? Well, technically, yes. There were British rifled muzzle-loading guns present at various places, but that not in active naval use. They would be the guns that were present because they had been built into shore fortifications in the Victorian period, and the guns technically still worked, so if anyone came near, you might as well use them. You know, there's 110-ton guns in Gibraltar and Malta, so if anybody had tried invading either one of them, they would have been used, because why not at that point? And similar for other coastal fortifications. But in terms of, you know, ships at sea using some old rifled muzzle-loading gun, no, that's not a thing. The pom-poms, that varies, because the octuple, quadruple pom-poms, etc., the kind of stuff you see most commonly, they're not massively old weapons. They are older than 20mm Oerlikons and 40mm Bofors, but they're not completely old and obsolete. There are multiple generations of the 2-pounder pom-pom, and some of the older guns are very definitely World War I vintage and obsolete, but you have to try and work out which particular version you're looking at. And of course, the more modern, newly manufactured 40mm pom-poms, high velocity ones, or ones that could be used with high velocity ammunition, are the more prevalent in the Royal Navy. There might be some of the much older ones being used again in second line duties, perhaps on the little paddle wheel flak ships that the Royal Navy deploys in various British ports, but again, not really a particularly frontline weapon. And similarly with older Krupp guns, yeah, they're around. Here's the 11-inch guns at Oscaborg, for instance, the ones that actually sank Blucher, but again, you know, it's a case of mostly in older coastal fortifications, because at the end of the day, if somebody comes at you and you happen to have a big gun, does it really matter if it's 10, 20, 50 or 60 years old? If the gun still works and it can fire some kind of high explosive or armor-piercing round at your opponent, then you might as well use it. Architect096 asks, on average, how many men were needed to maintain a carrier's air group? And were they part of the squadron assigned to a given carrier or members of the ship's crew? I assume that it depended on the navy and the ships in question, but was there some sort of standard of X number of men per aircraft or Y number of men responsible for maintaining all of them? Yeah, unfortunately, it's a very, very variable question, and part of it depends on, you know, how is the navy structured. So obviously an Essex class is going to have considerably more people aboard for the maintenance of the air group than, say, an Illustrious class, because there's just going to be more aircraft. But also, an Essex class will tend to do most of its maintenance up to and including major maintenance on the ship. So whilst both ships will have a cadre of, if you like, major repairs guys, workshop guys, the one on the Essex class is going to be both absolutely and proportionally larger than what you'd find on an Illustrious class. Because, of course, the Illustrious class would theoretically be subordinating most of that to something like Unicorn, whereas on the US ship it would be mostly internal. Then again, as time goes on, British ships with double hangars would tend to use the entire lower hangar for maintenance, which could flip things around again in terms of proportional and absolute numbers. As far as which part of the crew were these people in charge of maintenance part of, some of them would be part of the core ship's crew. The ship's own machine shops and etc. would be manned by the dedicated ship's crew, but the squadrons would also come, or the air groups in the US case, would come with their own maintenance and servicing crews as well. So when an air group or a squadron left the ship, they would usually take some of those people with them, much as a land-based squadron would have its own aircraft fitters and technicians, but a certain element would also still remain with the ship. Primarch 359 asks, a prominent returning theme of the channel is the lost opportunities caused by the Treasury limiting naval spending. Are there any times, in your opinion, when the naval budget of the United Kingdom was too high, particularly when there were other pressing non-defence budgetary priorities of the nation? I would say if you're going to identify one time period in, let's say, the last couple of hundred years when Royal Navy budgets were probably a little bit too high, I would probably go for the 1870s through to the end of the 1880s. And the reason I say that is that post then, so when you're getting into the 1890s, there's a bit of a building competition going on again, so you need budget for that. And obviously you've got World War I and into World War II. Before then, the French are mounting quite a determined run at becoming the supreme ironclad fleet, so in the 1860s, so you need budget then. Obviously you've got the Napoleonic Wars at the very beginning of the 1800s, and then in the sort of 1815 to 1860 period, you've got the advent of steam, you've got the Crimean War, you've got the French still trying to outbuild you, so you need budget then. But post-Franco-Prussian War, up to kind of the start of the pre-dreadnought era, there are a lot of ongoing issues in the UK, social issues that would eventually be addressed in the early 20th century. And there's also the question of what to do with the Empire. And the Royal Navy budget still remains fairly high. And you see this because in that period, this 1870s and 1880s, the Royal Navy is essentially not quite out of ideas, but they're building almost bespoke individual counters. So the Italians start building Italia, the British build Inflexible. The Russians build the first armoured cruiser, the British build a pair of bespokes to counter that. Powerful and Terrible, again, bespoke, extremely large, expensive cruisers to counter one particular threat. To me, that indicates you've got too much time and money on your hands, because what you should be doing, even as the global superpower, is you should be rationalizing the way you spend your money. So, yeah, sure, somebody might build one big armored cruiser. Sure, somebody might build one big battleship, but instead of spending absolute fortunes on individual bespoke solutions that then don't really translate into further construction orders, what you should be doing is actually similar to what the British would later do in the early 20th century, of just going, okay, yeah, sure, you can do that. We're going to build half a dozen or more ships, and at the lower end of things, at least, cruisers and destroyers and so forth. Yeah, maybe individually our cruisers or destroyers might not be the single most powerful on the planet, but they'll be 90-95% as good as the most powerful one on the planet. But because we haven't spent all that extra on bells and whistles, that last 5% or so, and we can build them en masse, our cost of per unit is actually quite low and quite budget efficient. And similarly, I think that's what they should have done. Because, yeah, sure, Italia or whatever is a reasonable-ish threat, But they built Devastation and Thunderer. They could tweak the design very slightly, which is how they get Dreadnought. If the Ironclad version, if they'd just gone, instead of building Inflexible, if they'd just gone, you know what, we'll just build half a dozen of those and send 4 of them to the Mediterranean, well, there's your problem solved. And similarly with cruisers, you don't have to build an all-singing, all-dancing perfect counter. You build half a dozen or more near-perfect counters, and you find they're suddenly a lot cheaper. And finally, Two Squirrels in a Trench Coat asks, how are the blocking plans for dry docking damaged ships amended? How do yards survey the damage and assess the structural integrity of the ship to come up with these amendments in a timely manner? It depends greatly on how bad the damage is, but generally speaking, you would have a blocking plan available, and then ideally, while the ship is not in the dry dock, but worst case scenario, the ship is in the dry dock, you would send divers down. So what you would do, let's say the ship's quite badly damaged, it needs to get in the dry dock ASAP. You would take your blocking plan as per whatever it is you think the blocking plan needs to be for the ship in its normal condition. You lay that out, and okay, fine, blocking plan is in place for the ship as should be. You bring the ship in, you then go and get divers, and you go down and go, okay, where are things wrong? Has the keel been distorted this way or that way, and the various other points where you want to support the ship. If they have been, and if therefore having a block in a particular place is going to be a major problem because it's now going to maybe punch through a bit of displaced hull plating or something like that, then you can have individual blocks moved around to match up with what the ship requires. And obviously, if you do that survey outside of the dry dock, then you'd have to obviously have the divers come up, report their findings, adjust it all on the plans, and then they move the blocks in the dry dock when it's dry, which is a little bit easier. But obviously, if the ship's already in the dry dock, they can just go, oh, okay, that needs to go 4 feet to the left. We'll do that while we're down here, and so forth. And then you pop the ship on the newly revised layout. Now, that is only the case when you've got some serious distortion to the point that the load-bearing elements of the ship have shifted. And to be perfectly honest, if you've got stuff that's happened that bad, 9 times out of 10, that ship's just going to scrap anyway. And to give you some idea of just how bad it can be when you don't actually adjust the blocking plan, but the ship is very badly damaged. Think of the damage to HMS Belfast when she hit that magnetic mine, or was hit by the mine, more accurately. Her entire keel and the whole bodywork of the ship had distorted upwards over a section amidships. But they just said, okay, we'll put her on her standard blocking plan. The stern will sit on that. The bow will sit on that. And yeah, this bit amidships, she's a bit too high. But the genius in that was, of course, now the bit that had bent up was unsupported and now had all the weight of the ship pressing down on it. And they just kept an eye on that over time. And gradually, the ship essentially bent itself back into shape, which was quite the inventive solution, basically using the ship's own weight against it. So it very much depends on exactly not only the extent of the damage, which, as I say, you can either assess in the water or in the dry dock while the ship is still afloat with divers, but also what kind of damage. Because, yeah, a vertical distortion like you had with Belfast, that can be solved by just putting it on the standard blocking plan and letting it realign itself. Whereas if you've had, say, a major underwater explosion significantly to the side, like a torpedo impact, if that's shoved part of one of your supporting keel lines off center, then you do need to actually physically move the blocks. And that wraps up the Patreon Dry Dock for this month. Thank you very much to everybody who's listening, everybody who submitted questions. And, well, if you want a question in this Patreon Dry Dock, then, well, the next one, then obviously a link in the video description below and all that good stuff. At the time that you're listening to this, I, believe it or not, have 2 more overseas trips for the year before I'm just done. And then I won't have to travel again for months, which is great for me. So I will be heading over to Italy in mid-October, around the northern part of Italy for the most part. About as far south as I'll go is Rome. And that's the week of the 13th through to the 20th, and exact schedule will be posted soon. And separately, I've already, obviously, as you know, moderated a panel at the USNI for late A at 80, and USS New Jersey is doing their own panel, similar one, and that is on, I believe, the 26th of October. So I will be there as well. Hopefully see some of you there. In any case, more information to come soon. Bye for now.